In history, we often celebrate men and women who achieve great things. Conquerors who spread Hellenic culture throughout the ancient world. Russian empresses that changed the course of the empire's history. Yet, perhaps one of the most fascinating figures in history conquered no land, ruled no empire, and in fact saw human civilization as one of our greatest failings. A figure some call the Father of Cynicism. Diogenes of Sinope. That's right, it's another episode of Can I Pronounce This Without Insulting an Entire Language Group? Now that we're well past 1k, I'm expecting a mobile gaming app to call me up any second to sponsor me. Any second now. For now, however, you can support me by getting access to these videos 48 hours early on Patreon. You can buy my screenplay on Amazon, and if you really love my moustache, you can have it rub against you daily by buying my merch, or you can lick it on one of the mugs. Whatever floats your boat. I ain't judging. If none of that floats your boat, the easiest way to support me is to like, subscribe, share, and tap that bell icon to get notified whenever I upload. Now on with the video. Now we're going to start as we mean to go on. You see, we don't know exactly when Diogenes was born, and this "we don't know exactly" is a very common theme throughout Diogenes' life. As far as we know, Diogenes of Sinope was born around 404 BCE and he passed away around 323 BCE. Diogenes began his life as a citizen of Sinope, an ancient Greek city in the northernmost tip of modern-day Turkey, touching the Black Sea. Diogenes' father Caesius was entrusted with the money of the city and adulterated the coinage. This essentially means that he diluted its value. Alternatively, it may have been Diogenes himself that committed the adulteration and was exiled alongside his father. After he was exiled, Diogenes visited Delphi near Mount Parnassus. Specifically, he visited the seat of Pythia, the home of the oracle, the priestess of the sanctuary, dedicated to the god Apollo. At this point in his life, Diogenes still sought to repair his damaged reputation. When he asked the oracle how to do this, she replied, "Deface the currency."
Ironic.
Now that is what had got him into this situation in the first place, so Diogenes decided to take the advice figuratively, deciding to deface the currency of society. According to Greek biographer Diogenes Laertius, he really defaced the currency, giving to matters of convention nothing of the weight that he granted to matters that accord with nature, and asserting that the manner of life he lived was the same as that of Heracles when he preferred freedom to everything. From here, Diogenes made his way to Athens. It's also possible he never actually visited the oracle and just went straight to Athens. We don't know exactly. Diogenes may have had a slave named Manes when he arrived in Athens, but supposedly set him free when they arrived in the city. Apparently, Diogenes told Manes, if Manes can live without Diogenes, then Diogenes can live without Manes. Diogenes' next step was to try and find himself a place to live, but this took a little bit of time and eventually he found himself getting bored and understandably started feeling a little sorry for himself. The biographer and writer Plutarch tells the story from this dark time in Diogenes' life in which he found himself in the corner of a room trying to sleep whilst some wealthier Athenians partied. Understandably, some darker thoughts began to cross his mind as he took stock of his situation. It is at this point that Diogenes noticed a mouse nibbling on some crumbs on the floor. A moment later, however, a mouse, it is said, crept up and busied itself with the crumbs of his bread, whereupon he once more recovered his spirits and said to himself, as though rebuking himself for cowardice, "What are you saying, Diogenes? Your leavings make a feast for this creature, but as for you, a man of birth and breeding, just because you cannot be getting drunk over there, reclining on soft and flowery couches, do you bewail and lament your lot." Diogenes then came to a conclusion. No longer in a place of despair, he realised that if a mouse can be content with a few breadcrumbs, then a higher life form such as a human being should be content with just as little. This began his ascesis, or ascetic way of life. Essentially a life of self-discipline. So Diogenes decided to take up residence in a tub or pithos in the Matroon. He may have also decided to take up residence in the Athenian agora in a rain barrel, surviving by begging or foraging for food himself. Later in life, he would just straight up receive gifts from his admirers. We don't know exactly what his living conditions were like, and he may have lived in a wine cask or a large clay pot. Diogenes would seek guidance from a famous orator in Athens called Gorgias, but he also sought out a famous student of Socrates, Antisthenes, the founder of the Cynic school of thought. Although Antisthenes didn't normally take on students, but Diogenes persisted, literally wearing down the philosopher until Antisthenes relented. Whilst he shadowed the student of Socrates, Antisthenes eventually became enraged because Diogenes simply wouldn't leave him alone. Antisthenes raised his staff to threaten Diogenes, but Diogenes simply responded, "Strike, for you will find no wood hard enough to keep me away from you, so long as I think you've something to say." It must be said we don't know exactly if Diogenes was in fact a student of Antisthenes, or even if the two men met. What is clear is that Antisthenes' teachings did influence Diogenes. The word cynic actually comes from the ancient Greek word kainikos, meaning dog-like. This is because Diogenes lived much like a dog and was seemingly inspired by their carefree lifestyle. He was also always around dogs, and you'll probably see the ancient cynics surrounded by them in his various portrayals. When asked why he was referred to as a dog, Diogenes replied, "I fawn on those who give me anything, I yelp at those who refuse, and I set my teeth in rascals." There is a distinction between ancient cynicism and modern cynicism. For example, ancient cynicism is spelt with an uppercase C, whereas modern cynicism is spelt with a lowercase c. This is because they're actually fairly different, with ancient cynicism being all about being free of social norms, and modern cynics believing that human beings are selfish and only think about themselves and are just not that sincere. Whereas Antisthenes is known for being a little bit more serious, Diogenes is known for his great sense of humour, which you'll see in just a second. Whilst living it rough, Diogenes owned nothing other than a knapsack, the clothes on his back, and a bowl. He used this bowl to have people serve him food or to scoop up water. One day, however, Diogenes noticed a young boy drinking water with his hands. So Diogenes threw the bowl away, although some stories do say he gave the bowl to the child. He was quoted as saying, "A child has beaten me in the plainness of living, and fool that I am, to have been carrying superfluous baggage all this time." Yes, Diogenes considered a bowl a superfluous baggage. Diogenes had a complete sense of shamelessness and sought to reposition the idea of social convention below that of nature and reason. He saw social norms as an affront to nature and rejected them as a path to the true nature of humanity. Diogenes thought that if an act wasn't considered shameful when it was committed privately, then it shouldn't be considered shameful when committed publicly. One way Diogenes fought against this was by simply eating in the Athenian marketplace, because this was considered taboo. When asked why he was doing this, he simply said because he was hungry. However, Diogenes didn't just get hungry, and when he had different needs surface, he took care of them publicly as well. You see, Diogenes never married and dealt with any sexual desires he had himself, publicly. This got him sent to court, where he came out against the allegations against him by saying, "If only it were as easy to relieve my hunger by rubbing my belly." Diogenes was a massive critic of Plato and saw him as nothing but a pompous sellout, and often disparaged his metaphysical pursuits. One of the most famous interactions between the two men happened when Plato described a human being as a featherless biped. For this he received great praise and admiration, but Diogenes thought this was stupid. So he set out to show everyone just how stupid it was. Diogenes plucked a chicken and took it to Plato's academy, where he declared, "Behold, here is Plato's man." This led Plato updating his description to be a featherless biped with broad nails. Plato did try to come back at Diogenes, however. He once tried to humble the Cynic when he saw him washing lettuces, saying, "Had you paid court to Dionysius, you wouldn't now be washing lettuces." Dionysius being the ruler of Syracuse at the time. However, Diogenes quickly quipped back. "If you had washed lettuces, you wouldn't have had to have paid court to Dionysius." This highlighted that Diogenes was the true philosopher, whilst Plato had sold himself out to the rich and powerful. Diogenes didn't just seek to disrupt society for no reason, he simply sought to instill his own version of reason and virtue. To Diogenes, a human being must act in accord with nature, for it is in a human's nature to act in accord with reason. This led to him famously lighting a lamp in broad daylight and shining it in people's faces, claiming, "I am looking for a human being," although some alternative stories have him looking for an honest man. He did this as a way of forcing people to look inwards on themselves and how they wanted to live versus how they actually lived under the strict conventions of society. One time, Diogenes was thrown some bones by some Athenian elites, who then laughed and called him a dog. So he treated them as a dog would and marked his territory. His territory just happened to be them. For the most part, the Athenians loved Diogenes, and when a boy broke his humble abode, he was beaten and forced to buy a new one, although in some stories it's the citizens that buy Diogenes a new home. However, ironically, Diogenes probably didn't care about this, as it was a worldly possession, and worldly possessions were a trap, keeping you in the dream. It's also possible that this story took place in Corinth. We don't know exactly. Aristotle referred to Diogenes as a familiar figure, whilst Plato described him as a Socrates gone mad. You've probably guessed this by now, but Diogenes rejected the idea of manners as a lie. He believed in complete truthfulness at all times and under any circumstance. He didn't care for social class, and he simply treated everyone the exact same. Even great Hellenic kings. Whilst some branded him mad, Diogenes argued that it was everyone else that was mad because convention lacked reason. For Diogenes, every individual must allow reason to guide their conduct, or, like an animal, they will be led by a leash. Diogenes was quite literally saying we live in a society. He would have dominated 4chan. His reasoning was that reason guides you away from mistakes and towards the best way to live life. He argued that his detractors wished they could live the life he lived, but only he was brave enough to actually do it. Essentially, Diogenes is the only person in history to use the "know you" argument and win. As you can probably tell from his interactions with Plato, Diogenes hated sophisms, which are just a clever but false argument often used to deceive or simply to make the person making the argument look smarter. Diogenes is very much a seeing is believing type of person. When someone argued that he had horns, he simply placed his hands upon his head to prove that they weren't there. When someone else argued that there was no such thing as motion, Diogenes simply stood up and walked away to prove that there was. He believed that society was completely made up by human beings and didn't connect with truth and virtue. To Diogenes, society was, and by his standards very much still is, living in a dream state. Diogenes wanted us to escape the Matrix. This idea was not new amongst philosophers at the time. Heraclitus, Xenophanes and Socrates all argued that human beings needed to escape their dream state and achieve full awareness of themselves. Ironically, the allegory of the cave by Plato covers this theme really well, and much to the disapproval of Diogenes, deserves a video of its own. Diogenes is actually one of the few people in history to actually take this idea and put it into practice, although the way he put it into practice is possibly not quite what the others had in mind. A piece of writing on Diogenes from Laertius actually gives us a glimpse into Diogenes' mind. On one occasion when he was asked, what was the most excellent thing among men? And he said, freedom of speech. As we can see, Diogenes was unfathomably based. For Diogenes, a good life was simply one lived in accordance with nature and your own natural tendencies. You may seem mad to others around you, but as long as you're being true to yourself, it simply doesn't matter because you just don't care. You live in total freedom, and that is a life worth living. One time, Diogenes praised an indifferent harp player. When asked why he did this, he simply responded, because he plays the harp and does not steal. When asked about his favourite wine, he said, that for which others pay. And after my last trip to a Wetherspoons, I do concur. No one wants to have to take out 2 bank loans for a couple pints. Once he saw the child of a courtesan whom he compared to a deadly honeyed potion throwing stones into a crowd. He called out to the child and said, be careful not to hit your father. Bro didn't give a... Another time, Diogenes noticed a bad archer practicing, so to avoid being harmed, he sat down directly in front of the target. When asked when a man should marry, he said, a young man shouldn't marry just yet, and an old man not at all. When asked why he anointed his feet with scent, he said because if he put it on his head, it would pass into the air above him and he'd be unable to smell it. I mean, it actually kind of makes sense. Now, Diogenes believed in living a very hard life, walking barefoot in the winter and rolling through hot sand during the summer, training himself to only live off of what he needed. He often asked statues for money or food, and when asked why he did this, he simply said that he was getting himself used to being refused. He did all these things so that even the small things in life, like a warm sunrise after a cold night, would bring him great joy. Diogenes was said to be deeply inspired by the 12 labours of Heracles. He valued absolute freedom above everything else, wanting not just to unshackle himself from the constraints of society, but the shackles of his body upon his soul. When asked what he actually got out of his philosophical lifestyle, he responded, if nothing else, I am prepared for whatever happens. Diogenes hated intellectual pageantry, being quoted as saying, the mathematicians kept their eyes fixed on the sun and the moon and overlooked what was under their feet. He would go further with this, evaluating society. That men contended with one another in punching and kicking, but that no one showed any emulation of the pursuit of virtue. That the musicians fitted the strings of the lyre properly, but left all the habits of their soul ill-arranged. That orators were anxious to speak justly, but not at all about acting so. Now, there is a quote from Diogenes that completely sums up his view of humanity. Every simple gift of the gods has been complicated by human beings. No matter your opinions on the man, no matter your opinions on his philosophy, that's spot on. Diogenes claimed no loyalty to any state or government body, and he is said to have been the first to use the term cosmopolitan. Much like many other ancient Greeks, Diogenes loved to go to the theatre, except he liked to come in just as the performance was finishing and as everyone else was leaving. Once he was walking backwards as people laughed at him and mocked him. The Cynic simply responded to them by quipping, "Aren't you ashamed you walk backward along the whole path of existence and blame me for walking backward along the path of the promenade?" The wandering philosopher would visit the Olympian, Isthmian and Pythian games to understand what brought people joy and what brought them sorrow. For example, a rigged World Cup quarter-final brought many sporting fans sorrow. One time he was at the Isthmian Games talking to a crowd of people about resisting temptation. Once he had finished the conversation, he simply squatted down and defecated right then and there. Because why not? Finally, a fan invited him into his home. However, he had one rule. He asked Diogenes not to spit whilst in the house. So, when presented with this one singular rule, Diogenes produced a large dollop of phlegm and spat it in the man's face. During a voyage to Aegina, Diogenes found himself captured by pirates. According to the 1st century writer Philo of Alexandria, Diogenes analysed his situation, saying that it was a most absurd thing for pigs and sheep, when they are going to be sold, to be carefully provided with abundant food, so as to be rendered fat and fleshy, but for the most excellent of all animals, man, to be reduced to a skeleton by bad food and continual scarcity, and so to be rendered of less value than before. When he finally got some good food, Diogenes cheerfully sat down and shared it with others. However, he noticed another captive in an understandable state of extreme despondency. Diogenes thought he would console them in the only way he knew how. Will you not give up being miserable? Take what you can get. Essentially what he's saying in an extremely brutally honest fashion is this is life now. Enjoy what you can. Eventually he was sold in a slave auction and was bought by a Corinthian named Xeniades. Xeniades asked Diogenes what he could do, and Diogenes responded in proper Diogenes fashion by informing Xeniades that he could govern men. Apparently Diogenes himself demanded Xeniades bought him, saying, "Sell me to that man, for he wants a master." Xeniades was incredibly impressed by this and had him tutor his sons. Diogenes would then go on to teach them his ascetic way of life. Xeniades actually called Diogenes a kind living god. He was in one of the worst situations possible, and was still completely unreactive to his position. In fact, he came out of the situation relatively favourably, all things considered. Things kept getting spicy for Diogenes as he still continued to live in his idea of a home. So when Corinth came under attack, probably from Philip II, the citizens began panicking and running around. In response to this, Diogenes began rolling his home up a hill and then letting it roll down again, and then repeating the process. When asked why he was doing this, he said that he was just being as useful as the rest of the citizens. Diogenes decided to teach a life lesson in the middle of a literal invasion. Now, whilst living in Corinth, Diogenes received a visitor, a little-known historical figure called Alexander the Great. Now, Alexander either heard of the Cynic and decided to go and meet him, or he heard of him through his teacher, Aristotle, who spoke highly of Diogenes. We don't know exactly. Either way, the young king of Macedon, who was just about to set out on his conquest of the Achaemenid Empire, decided to visit Diogenes. Alexander found Diogenes resting in the sunlight and asked the philosopher if there was anything he could do for him. Diogenes looked up at the king, who had become one of the most famous and influential figures in all of history, and simply responded, "Yes. Get out of my sunlight." Now, admittedly, Alexander was nowhere near the heights he would one day reach, but this was still a bold move from Diogenes. The little entourage that Alexander had with him stood stunned and in silence. Because if you know anything about Alexander the Great, you know he really doesn't like his ego being touched. So this moment could have really gone in any direction, but Alexander simply replied to Diogenes by saying, "If I were not Alexander, I would wish to be Diogenes." This was a polite, banterous equaliser in the conversation, but Diogenes decided he wasn't done with the Hellenic king, and he responded to Alexander by saying, "If I were not Diogenes, I too would wish to be Diogenes." And Alexander just laughed. Literally every story about Diogenes is him ripping into these really famous figures and somehow not being brutally murdered. Now, whilst this story may seem brutal, there is another version of the meeting between Alexander and Diogenes. This one where Alexander found Diogenes searching through a pile of bones. Alexander asked Diogenes why he was doing this, and Diogenes replied that, "I was searching for the bones of your father, but I could not distinguish them from the bones of slaves."
Damn!
On another occasion, some people were discussing the ancient Greek historian Callisthenes and his amazing treatment he was receiving from Alexander the Great. Diogenes, on the other hand, greatly disagreed with their assessment, arguing, "The man then is wretched, for he is forced to breakfast and dine whenever Alexander chooses." There are other versions of these meetings and other alleged interactions between Diogenes and Alexander the Great, but we don't know exactly how true these stories are. Diogenes did actually end up taking on students such as Crates of Thebes, another Cynic philosopher. Now, Diogenes may have actually stayed a slave until his passing, although in some stories he's freed immediately. In others, he becomes a cherished member of the Xeniades household. There are many stories about the passing of Diogenes, some where he voluntarily held his own breath, some where he ate a raw octopus, others where he ate a raw ox's foot, and in both cases obviously got food poisoning, and in some he just caught a disease. Others say he was splitting that same octopus between a pack of stray dogs when one of the animals bit him, or he was just simply bitten by a dog, in either case contracting rabies or just a simple infection via the bite. He may have also lived to the age of 90 and just simply conked out. We don't know exactly. The citizens of Corinth, like the people of Athens, loved Diogenes, so they buried him in a place of great honour by the city gates. They then built a monument over his gravesite. Ironically, this would have probably made Diogenes chuckle because it literally went against everything he stood for. In fact, when asked what should be done with his body after his passing, he explained that it should be thrown outside the city to feed the dogs. If I lack awareness, then why should I care what happens to me when I am dead? Whilst I get, sound logic there, Mr. Diogenes, that made me very uncomfortable. Because I have thanatophobia, as I've briefly covered on this channel before. The irony of me getting uncomfortable at that statement is Diogenes would be like, yeah, that's my job. Now, we don't know exactly where Diogenes' gravesite is, so you can't go and visit it to pay your respects anytime soon, unfortunately. A statue of him still stands in Sinop in modern-day Turkey. It depicts him holding his famous lantern and a dog sitting by his side. On the bronze statue there was a message that read, "Bronze grows old with time, but all eternity, Diogenes, will not erase your fame. For you alone gave morals the lesson of self-reliance and the easiest path through life." Diogenes of Sinope, the father of Cynicism, passed away the same year as Alexander the Great, my personal hero. One man conquered an empire and took that empire to the western bank of the Indus River, on the Indian subcontinent. The other had no possessions of his own, lived in what was essentially a storage container, and was surrounded by stray dogs. Yet my question to you is, which man was happier? Which man truly had nothing, and which man truly had everything? Which man lived the more fulfilled life? Diogenes himself insisted that he was contented and had lived a good life. In fact, his life is probably the best proof that his philosophy was onto something. Most people are forgotten to history, that is a fact. The likelihood that anyone will remember you past your great-grandchildren is slim to none. In fact, your great-grandchildren will probably know barely anything about you. I've just given half of my audience an existential crisis, and I'm sorry. Yet here is a man who literally lived in a barrel, literally lived in abject poverty by his own choice, and over 2,000 years later, we are still talking about him. Yet the irony of this is, he probably wouldn't care that we're still talking about him. What he would probably care about is the fact that we're yet to listen to anything he had to say. Now, I'll be honest with you. I was never that much of a Diogenes fan. I've always seen Alexander the Great as the greatest historical figure of all time. But to make this video, I have watched hours and hours, I have read pages and pages of information on Diogenes. And whilst Alexander the Great was spectacular in a number of stories told about him, Diogenes was great in every single story. And with that, the video comes to an end. I hope you enjoyed. Let me know in the comments down below if you did. Also, let me know if I missed anything or if I got anything wrong. And most importantly, let me know what you would like to see next. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, share, and tap that bell icon to get notified whenever I upload. And as always, thank you for watching. Bye.